I never imagined my life could shatter in a single moment. But there I was, standing at the bedroom door frozen, as I watched my stepson's shirt slide off his shoulders. My heart raced not from anger, but from something far more dangerous. I knew it was wrong, yet I couldn't tear myself away. What happened next changed everything. And there was no going back. My name is Rachel, and I'm 39 years old. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood with my husband, Daniel, and his son, Ethan. From the outside, our life looks picture perfect, a beautiful home, a stable income, and family dinners around the table. But behind closed doors, things feel different. Daniel is a corporate lawyer, always busy with meetings and late-night phone calls. Over the years, his career took center stage, leaving little time for me or our marriage. I often find myself eating dinner alone, staring at the empty chair across the table, wondering when things changed. I used to feel cherished, desired even. We had passion once, but now we barely exchange more than routine pleasantries. The loneliness started creeping in slowly, but recently, it became unbearable. Ethan moved in with us after his mother passed away 2 years ago. At 22, he's charming, confident, and unexpectedly mature. Despite the sadness of losing his mom, he brought new energy into the house, a reminder of what it felt like to be noticed. We bonded over late-night conversations and movie marathons. He made me laugh again, something I hadn't done in so long. He paid attention to me, complimenting my cooking, my smile, and even the little details Daniel never seemed to notice anymore. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The lingering glances, the accidental touches, the way his eyes would lock with mine just a moment too long. But deep down I knew I wasn't imagining anything. I tried to push the thoughts away, convincing myself that I was just lonely and vulnerable. But then, one evening, everything shifted. Daniel was working late, again, and Ethan offered to stay up and keep me company. We talked for hours, our conversation growing more personal, more intimate. The tension was undeniable, and by the time I realized how close we were sitting, it was already too late. I felt my heart racing, unsure if I should pull away or lean in. That night changed something between us, and the lines I had vowed never to cross suddenly didn't feel so clear anymore. The days that followed were a blur of guilt, curiosity, and longing. I tried to convince myself that what happened that night was nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness, a harmless slip that would never happen again. But I couldn't forget it. Every time I walked past Ethan's room, I felt my pulse quicken. I'd catch myself replaying our conversations, his laughter echoing in my mind. Worse, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes lingered on me, as if he saw me, really saw me, in a way Daniel hadn't in years. I told myself to keep my distance. I buried myself in chores, errands, and half-finished hobbies just to stay busy. But it didn't matter. Ethan was always there, offering to help with groceries, complimenting my outfits, or brushing past me in the kitchen. Each interaction felt charged, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the tension kept building. It wasn't just in my head either. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I felt his presence behind me before he even spoke. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. I turned, startled, and almost dropped the plate I was holding. "No, I'm fine," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he took the dish from me. My breath caught, and I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "I think you've been working too hard," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. "You need to relax." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The way he looked at me, so intense, so deliberate, made my stomach flutter. I felt trapped between the weight of my guilt and the thrill of his attention. Before I could say anything, we heard the sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway. Ethan stepped back, but not before his fingers lightly grazed my wrist. A touch so subtle, yet electrifying that it left me reeling. That night, as I lay in bed next to Daniel, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's words, his touch, and the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. I hated myself for it, but I craved more. The tension escalated further the next afternoon. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when Ethan knocked and poked his head in. "Need help with that?" he asked, flashing a boyish grin. "No, I've got it," I replied, trying to sound casual. But he stepped inside anyway, closing the door behind him. "Rachel," his voice was softer now. "We need to talk." My stomach tightened. "About what?" "About the other night," he said, stepping closer. "And about this." Before I could protest, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. My breath hitched, and my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Ethan, we can't," I whispered, taking a step back. "But we already did," he said, his eyes darkening. "And you know it wasn't just in the moment. You feel it too." I wanted to deny it, to push him away and walk out of the room. But I couldn't. Because he was right. The way he looked at me made me feel alive again. Seen, desired, wanted. And no matter how wrong it was, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. As he stepped closer, the space between us disappeared, and I felt myself leaning in, caught in a dangerous, intoxicating pull that I no longer had the strength to resist. I tried to stay away from Ethan after that night, but it was impossible. Everywhere I turned, he was there, leaning against the kitchen counter with that teasing smile or brushing past me in the hallway, his touch lingering just a second too long. It wasn't just his presence that consumed me. It was the way he looked at me, like he could see right through me. It made my heart race and my knees weak, and no matter how many times I reminded myself that it was wrong, the craving only grew stronger. One evening, Daniel was away on another business trip, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. I told myself to stay busy, to keep my hands occupied with cleaning or baking or anything that would distract me from the thoughts swirling in my head. But when Ethan walked into the living room, his hair still damp from the shower and his t-shirt clinging to his chest, my resolve shattered. "Can I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the couch where I sat pretending to read. I should have said no. I should have gotten up and walked away. But instead I nodded. He sat beside me, closer than he needed to, his thigh brushing against mine. My body tensed, but I didn't move away. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice low and warm. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. My heart was pounding, and I could feel his eyes on me, burning into me. "Rachel," he said softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "You don't have to pretend." "Pretend what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That you don't want this," he replied, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "I see the way you look at me." I should have pushed his hand away. I should have told him to stop. But instead, I leaned into his touch, my breath hitching as his thumb brushed my lips. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, leaning in closer. I couldn't. Before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine, soft at first, tentative, as if giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as weeks of tension exploded between us. His hands were everywhere, on my back, my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. I felt like I was drowning, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, needed. "We shouldn't be doing this," I gasped between kisses, but even as I said it, I was pulling him closer. "Then stop me," he whispered, his lips trailing down my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I didn't stop him. Instead, I let him pull me into his lap, my heart racing as his hands explored my body. The heat between us was unbearable, and I knew there was no turning back. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. "Daniel," I whispered, panic flooding through me. Ethan jumped up, his eyes wide as he straightened his shirt. "Go to your room," I hissed, shoving him toward the hallway just as the front door opened. Daniel walked in, his face tired but smiling. "Hey," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. "Missed you." I forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see the guilt written all over my face. "Missed you too," I replied, my voice trembling. He kissed me on the cheek, then glanced toward the hallway. "Is Ethan home?" "Yeah," I said quickly. "He's in his room." Daniel nodded, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The way his lips felt against mine, the way his hands set my skin on fire. I knew it was wrong. I knew it couldn't happen again. But deep down, I also knew that it would. The next morning, I woke up early, hoping to avoid Ethan. But he was already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with that same teasing smile. "Morning," he said, his eyes locking on mine. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. But the heat between us was undeniable. "We need to talk," he said, stepping closer. "No," I said quickly. "We need to stop." "You don't mean that," he said, his voice low. "I do," I insisted, but the way my voice trembled gave me away. He reached out, brushing his fingers against my arm. "Then tell me to stop," he said again. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I let him pull me into another kiss, and just like that, I was his again. The days that followed felt like a dangerous game. I told myself every morning that it had to stop, that whatever had been happening between Ethan and me was over. But by nightfall, I was in his arms again, surrendering to the passion that made me feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. I knew it couldn't last. Secrets like this always come out, and deep down, I was terrified of what would happen when it did. One evening, Daniel announced he'd be working late again. It had become so routine that I didn't even question it. But this time something felt different, off somehow. I brushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to nerves. Ethan was already home, lounging on the couch when Daniel left. As soon as the door closed, he turned to me with that mischievous smile that made my stomach flip. "Finally," he said, standing and crossing the room toward me. "Ethan, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. He ignored my words, brushing my hair back and leaning in. "Then tell me to stop," he whispered, just like he always did. I didn't. The kiss that followed was hungry and desperate, as though we both knew this might be the last time. We stumbled toward the stairs, our hands roaming as we made our way to my bedroom. Once inside, Ethan locked the door behind us and pulled me close. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured against my lips, his breath warm and intoxicating. "Me neither," I admitted, letting the words slip out before I could stop them. We didn't waste another second. Clothes fell to the floor, and we tumbled onto the bed, lost in the heat of the moment. But then a noise froze us in place. The front door. "Daniel," I whispered, panic flooding through me. Ethan shot up, scrambling to grab his clothes. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The footsteps were already coming up the stairs. "Hide," I hissed, pointing to the closet. Ethan dove inside just as the door handle turned. "Rachel?" Daniel's voice was calm, but something about it sent chills down my spine. I pulled the blanket around me, trying to appear as casual as possible. "You're home early," I said, forcing a smile. His eyes narrowed. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I lied, but my voice cracked. "Nothing," he repeated, stepping further into the room. His gaze swept over the bed, the rumpled sheets, the clothes scattered across the floor. Panic rose in my chest as he stepped closer to the closet. "Daniel, stop," I blurted out, but it was too late. He yanked the door open, and there stood Ethan, half-dressed, his face pale and frozen in terror. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's face turned red, his hands curling into fists as he turned back to me. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. What could I possibly say? "Get out," Daniel growled, glaring at Ethan. Ethan hesitated, looking at me as if waiting for some kind of instruction. "Go," I said softly, tears already spilling down my cheeks. He grabbed his shirt and disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone with Daniel and the wreckage of everything I'd built. "How long has this been going on?" Daniel demanded, his voice shaking with rage. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Was it worth it, he spat. Throwing away our marriage, our life for him? Tears streamed down my face, but I said nothing. What was there to say? Daniel grabbed his keys and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the walls shook. I collapsed onto the bed, sobbing as the weight of everything came crashing down. Hours passed before I found the strength to move. I wandered downstairs in a daze, half hoping Daniel would come back, even if it was just to yell at me some more. But the house was silent. I poured myself a glass of wine, my hands trembling as I took a sip. That's when I heard it, the soft creak of the back door opening. My heart leapt into my throat as Ethan stepped inside, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I admitted, setting the glass down and wiping my tears. He crossed the room in an instant, pulling me into his arms. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pressing his lips to my forehead. I wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave and never come back. But I couldn't. Instead, I melted into him, letting his warmth and comfort wash over me. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not leaving you." His words should have scared me. Instead, they made me feel safe. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, holding each other as the world outside fell apart. But deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The morning after Daniel left, the house felt eerily quiet, too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of me. My thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt, shame, and fear. I had destroyed everything. The life I had spent years building with Daniel was gone, and no matter how much I tried to piece it back together in my head, I knew it was beyond repair. Ethan tried to comfort me. He stayed close, constantly checking in, offering reassurances that we could figure things out. But every time he touched me, I flinched. The guilt was suffocating. "I can't do this," I finally said, my voice trembling as I pulled away from him. Rachel. No, I cut him off, stepping back. You don't understand. I've ruined everything, my marriage, my life. This was a mistake. His face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he stepped away. If that's how you feel. And then he left. I thought that would make things easier. That if Ethan was out of the picture, I could pick up the pieces of my life and move forward. But it didn't. Days passed and Daniel never came home. My calls went unanswered, my messages ignored. The loneliness hit harder than ever before, but this time it was laced with regret. I missed Daniel, but I missed Ethan too, his warmth, his touch, the way he made me feel alive. One afternoon, I finally worked up the courage to go to Daniel's office. I rehearsed what I would say 100 times during the drive, but when I stepped into the lobby and saw the look on his secretary's face, I knew. He's not here, she said softly, avoiding my gaze. Where is he? I asked, my voice cracking. He took a leave of absence, she replied, and before I could ask another question, she added, I think it's best if you give him space. Space. The word echoed in my head the entire drive home. Space wasn't going to fix this. Nothing was. That night I broke down. I sat on the bathroom floor, crying until there was nothing left. I had never felt so alone, so completely and utterly lost. And then there was a knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing as I wiped the tears from my face and hurried to open it. Ethan stood there, his eyes filled with worry. I shouldn't be here, he said quickly. But I couldn't stay away. I wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to leave and never come back. But instead I stepped aside, letting him in. We sat on the couch in silence for what felt like hours before he finally spoke. I hate seeing you like this, he said softly, reaching for my hand. You shouldn't be here, I whispered, but I didn't pull away. Neither should he, Ethan replied. He left, Rachel. He gave up on you. His words hit me harder than I expected, and before I knew what was happening, I was crying again. Only this time, Ethan was there to catch me. He held me as I sobbed, whispering words of comfort that I barely heard. And when I finally stopped crying, he kissed me. I didn't stop him. That night, I let myself fall into Ethan's arms again, knowing it wouldn't fix anything, but also knowing I couldn't let go. The next morning, I woke up tangled in the sheets with him, the sunlight streaming through the window. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm, but the moment was short-lived. I heard the front door open, and my heart dropped. Daniel. I shot up, scrambling to cover myself as Ethan jumped out of bed. Stay here, I whispered before rushing downstairs. Daniel was standing in the entryway, his eyes bloodshot and his face pale. We need to talk, he said, his voice hollow. I nodded, my stomach churning as I led him to the living room. He didn't sit. I came back to get my things, he said bluntly. I'm filing for divorce. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, but I couldn't argue. Daniel, Don't, he interrupted. I don't want explanations or apologies. It's done. Tears welled up in my eyes, but he didn't seem to care. I'll send someone to pick up the rest of my stuff, he said before turning and walking out the door. And just like that, it was over. I stood there frozen, until I felt Ethan's arms wrap around me from behind. It's going to be okay, he whispered. But as I looked out the window and watched Daniel's car disappear down the street, I couldn't help but wonder. Would it? In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than ever. Daniel was gone, and the silence left in his absence was deafening. I walked through each room, haunted by memories of the life we had built together. Memories that now felt distant, like echoes of a dream I couldn't wake up from. Ethan stayed. He tried to fill the void, but no matter how much he reassured me or held me close, the guilt lingered. At first, I convinced myself that we could make it work, that the passion and connection we shared were enough to justify the destruction we had caused. But the cracks in our fantasy began to show quickly. I couldn't look at Ethan without being reminded of what I had lost. Every touch, every kiss felt tainted, like a reminder of the woman I had become. The woman who had betrayed her husband and crossed a line she could never uncross. Ethan noticed the change in me. You regret it, don't you? He asked one evening as we sat in the dimly lit living room. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I don't regret feeling alive again, I finally said, my voice trembling. But I regret how it happened. I regret hurting Daniel. And I regret losing myself in the process. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I thought we were in this together, he said softly. We were, I replied. But now I don't know who I am anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of my decisions hit me all over again. Ethan stood and walked toward me, but this time I stepped back. "I need time," I said, "to figure out who I am and what I want. I can't do that if we're together." His face fell, but he didn't argue. "I'll give you space," he said quietly. "But I'm not giving up on you." And with that, he left. For the first time in weeks, I was alone, truly alone, and I knew it was exactly what I needed. I spent the next few months picking up the pieces of my life. I started therapy, trying to unravel the tangled emotions that had led me down such a destructive path. I focused on myself, rediscovering the parts of me that had been lost in the chaos of my marriage and the affair. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, and I questioned whether I had made the right decision. But with each passing day, I began to feel stronger, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. I reached out to Daniel eventually, not to reconcile, but to apologize. He didn't forgive me, and I didn't expect him to. But he listened, and that was enough. As for Ethan, he moved out shortly after we ended things. I haven't heard from him since, and maybe that's for the best. Looking back, I know now that what I felt for Ethan wasn't love, it was desperation. I had been so starved for affection, for attention, that I mistook infatuation for something deeper. I learned the hard way that passion can be intoxicating, but it's no substitute for trust, stability, and respect. And while I'll always carry the weight of my choices, I also carry the lessons they taught me. Because no matter how tempting it is to chase what's missing, it's never worth losing yourself, or the people who truly love you, in the process. What would you have done in my situation? Could you forgive betrayal, or would you walk away forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more shocking and emotional stories like this one. You won't believe what's coming next. Stay tuned.